The room went dead silent when she walked through those doors at 2,147 hours. Sarah Chen moved through Seattle General's ER like smoke, present but unnoticed, efficient but invisible. Her scrubs were regulation blue. Her hair was pulled back so tight it erased her face. Her name badge showed only Thest Chen, RN, in letters small enough to miss if you weren't looking. And nobody was looking. Not at the night shift nurse with the careful hands and the downcast eyes who said yes, doctor, and of course, doctor, and kept her head precisely where it belonged, down. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer above the empty trauma bays. 200 hours on a Tuesday meant the violent accidents hadn't started yet, the overdoses were still asleep, the stabbings hadn't happened. Sarah used these quiet hours to work. She'd been working here for 3 years, moving through this hospital like someone who'd learned long ago that invisibility was survival. The other nurses called her reliable. The doctors called her competent. Dr. Caldwell called her nothing, which meant he was still looking for a reason. She checked the crash cart, defibrillator pads secured, epinephrine pre-filled, the ACLS medications arrayed in perfect order like a surgical tray. Her fingers moved with the unconscious precision of someone who'd done this same task 1,247 times before. Not approximately. Not roughly. Exactly 1,247 times. She knew because she counted. Counting was control. Control was survival. The ambulance radio crackled at 0234 hours, Seattle General. This is Medic 7 inbound, ETA 4 minutes. Male, age unknown, multiple penetrating wounds to the chest and abdomen, shrapnel embedded in soft tissue, unconscious on scene, no identification, no next of kin available, vitals unstable, we're running hot. Sarah's head came up. Shrapnel. Not a knife wound. Not a bullet wound from a domestic dispute or a gang shooting. Shrapnel. The kind that came from IED detonation, from military-grade explosives, from places where people wore uniforms and followed protocols and left pieces of themselves behind in mud brick compounds. She pushed the thought down. That was 20 years ago. That was before. That was a woman named Major Sarah Chen who didn't exist anymore, whose service record had been classified and redacted and finally deleted from the Pentagon servers because the operation in Sanjin, Helmand Province officially never happened. The extraction from that valley, carrying a bleeding 8-year-old boy 3 miles through Taliban fire while CIA handlers screamed about plausible deniability, that had never happened either. The woman who'd survived that had been erased. She was a ghost. She was Chen, RN, night shift, competent but invisible. The ambulance doors burst open at 0238 hours, and Medic 7 wheeled their patient through like he was made of glass and fire. The trauma surgeon met them, Dr. Patterson, who was actually competent for mercy when the political appointees were running the day shift. Sarah moved into position before anyone asked her to, her movements automatic, her mind already mapping the injury pattern. The patient was a male in his 40s, unconscious, his jacket shredded, his shirt soaked through with blood that was somewhere between red and black. The kind of blood that meant volume loss. The kind of blood that meant minutes. Get him to trauma 2, Dr. Patterson ordered. Sarah, I need you on his left side. Not Nurse Chen. Not Miss Chen. Sarah. She was good enough to have a first name when minutes were running out. She moved with the team, her hands already reaching for the trauma shears that hung from her scrub pocket on a chain that had been rubbed smooth by 10,000 moments exactly like this one. The jacket came away in pieces. Cotton and synthetic blend, scorched at the edges, heavy with blood and something darker, accelerant, maybe, or just charred fabric. Sarah's hands worked with the automated precision of someone who'd cut away combat uniforms in field hospitals that didn't exist, in operations that officially never occurred, in a different lifetime when she'd been someone who mattered. And then her hands froze. The inner lining of the jacket had a patch sewn there, faded from sun and time and whatever had happened to this man in whatever place he'd been. Sarah's eyes found it, a small military unit insignia, colors worn almost to gray but still recognizable. 75th Ranger Regiment. The same unit. The same patch she'd worn under her own uniform 20 years ago in a valley called Sanjin, in a district called Jolin, in a country that the news stopped covering after the second year. Her breath caught. 3 seconds. That was all the time she gave herself. 1 second to recognize the symbol. 1 second to feel the floor of that mud brick compound shift beneath her feet like it had just happened. 1 second to remember the sound of mortar fire and a child screaming and her own voice ordering the extraction birds to get hot because she was bringing them their package and they had maybe 90 seconds before the entire ridge lit up. 3 seconds. Then her hands moved again, finishing their work, cutting away the rest of the garment with professional precision while her heart rate climbed and her left leg, the injured one, the one that still ached on cold mornings, sent a phantom spike of pain up her femur like it was remembering too. The patch was in her hand. She'd cut it away from the lining automatically, the way you remove foreign objects from a trauma patient, and now it lay across her palm like a grenade that had already detonated. Sarah. Dr. Patterson's voice. Questioning. She was standing still. Nurses didn't stand still. Competent nurses with jobs they needed to keep absolutely moved. Stabilizing his wounds, she said, and her voice was steady as a surgical laser. She pocketed the patch, muscle memory so old it predated conscious thought, and moved her hands to the patient's abdomen, assessing entry and exit patterns with the clinical detachment of someone who'd learned anatomy not from textbooks but from field medicine in a theater that officially didn't exist. They worked. Dr. Patterson called orders. The monitors beeped their electronic prayer. And for nurse hung units of O negative and Sarah guided them into the antecubital fossa with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than training. Her mind was 2 places at once, here, in this trauma bay, watching this ranger's vitals stabilize enough to move to surgery, and there, in a valley where the call sign was Sparrow because she was small and fast and the only female operator on the bird, and where a child's hand had gripped her neck so hard it left bruises that took 6 weeks to fade. They transferred the patient to the OR at 0256 hours. Sarah returned to the trauma bay to begin the post-resuscitation cleanup, blood disposal, equipment restocking, the small rituals of return to order. She moved through the motions with her head down, her hands efficient, her expression blank. This was who she was now. This was who she'd built herself to be. Invisible. Competent. Safe. She was restocking the crash cart when she remembered the jacket. Hospital protocol was explicit, patient belongings went to security. Logged. Documented. On the record. But Sarah had been on the record once, and the record had been erased so thoroughly that even the army couldn't find her when they tried. The record was dangerous. The record was a liability. She retrieved the jacket from the trauma bay trash, it was already destined for biohazard disposal, and carried it to the staff lockers. The patch was still in her scrub pocket, burning there like she could feel it radiating heat. She folded the jacket carefully, tucking it into her locker behind her spare shoes and the paperback novel she read during breaks, hiding it like contraband. The patch went in her pocket. She had an expired military ID in her locker too, from another lifetime, the rank of major still visible on the photograph of a woman with her hair buzzed short and her eyes that had already seen the worst. She was closing her locker when she felt the presence in the room like a shift in air pressure. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway of the break room, expensive shoes polished to a shine that cost more than Sarah's weekly salary. His hair was graying at the temples in a distinguished way that money could purchase. His suit jacket was tailored. His tie was the color of old blood. And his eyes were tracking her with the focused attention of a predator who'd just caught movement in the undergrowth. Nurse Chen, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful and menacing and ready to move. I saw you violate protocol in the trauma bay. Sarah turned to face him. Her expression was blank. Her voice was calm. When she spoke, it came out in the deferential tones of someone who'd learned that agreeing with authority figures was its own form of survival strategy. I'm sorry, Dr. Caldwell. I'm not sure what you... The patient's belongings, he continued, stepping into the break room. The space suddenly felt smaller. His presence had that effect, the kind of authority that made the air pressure change around it. You kept them. You didn't log them with security. Sarah didn't blink. She didn't tremble. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing that she understood what he was doing. He'd been waiting 3 years for her to make a mistake. He'd watched her work shifts that no one else wanted, perform procedures with a precision that made his day shift staff look sloppy, save lives with a quiet competence that reflected very badly on the political appointees he surrounded himself with. And now, finally, he had something to use. I was going to take them to security after restocking the crash cart, Sarah said. The lie was smooth. The lie was believable. The lie was the voice of the person she'd learned to be. His smile was the smile of a man who'd just caught a nurse breaking protocol. It was the smile of a man with institutional power, connections, allies, the kind of leverage that came from being married to someone on the hospital foundation board. He was the kind of threat that didn't need to raise his voice because he'd already decided she was finished. Make sure that you do, he said. And then he turned and walked out, his shoes clicking against the tile in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Sarah stood alone in the break room, her hand in her pocket, her fingers wrapped around a faded unit patch that connected her to a past that was supposed to be erased. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was controlled. But inside, the ghost of Major Sarah Chen was waking up from a 20-year sleep, and something was about to change. The sister arrived at the desk before the shift change, her voice climbing 3 octaves as she demanded answers. Where is he? Nobody will tell me anything. Is he alive? Can I see him? Her hands trembled as she gripped the counter, her phone clutched like it might shatter. Sarah was charting the patient's vitals when she heard Dr. Caldwell's voice slice through the ER like a scalpel, loud, theatrical, designed to be heard. Nurse Chen. It wasn't a question. It was a summons delivered in front of 7 staff members and the frantic sister. Sarah set down her pen and walked over, her face carefully neutral, every muscle controlled. Caldwell stood near the nursing station in his pristine white coat, his posture radiating authority like a general surveying conquered ground. His eyes had that predatory gleam she'd learned to recognize. He'd been waiting for this moment. Yes, doctor. Perhaps you can explain why this patient's belongings are currently in your locker instead of properly documented with hospital security where protocols explicitly require them to be. His voice dripped condescension, each word placed like a knife between her ribs. He didn't wait for her answer. He turned to the sister, his tone shifting to something almost sympathetic. I sincerely apologize for the confusion. Nurse Chen seems to believe that regulations don't apply to her, that perhaps she's confused about her place in this hospital's hierarchy. We have very strict protocols for patient property management, and our support staff sometimes struggle to understand the importance of chain of custody. Support staff. As if she were part of the custodial crew instead of someone who held lives together with her hands. The sister looked between them, uncertainty clouding her features. A younger nurse 2 stations over went very still. Sarah could feel eyes on her back, the weight of collective witness to her humiliation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in her ears. She took one measured breath through her nose, accessing the part of her that had remained calm during mortar fire in Helmand Province. The faded unit patch sat in her locker, hidden beneath her personal items. The same patch that had carried her through Sanjin, that marked her as belonging to something bigger than this hospital, this moment, this condescending physician whose entire authority depended on the assumption that she was exactly what she appeared to be. A nurse. Support staff. Someone who didn't belong. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands, steady as surgical steel, hung at her sides. She held Caldwell's gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to see that something had shifted in her expression, something he couldn't quite read and wouldn't quite understand. I've never been confused about my place, doctor, she said quietly, her voice carrying the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Have you? The room contracted. Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. His jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. The sister's eyes widened slightly. A monitor beeped 3 times in the distance. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of a line being crossed, not in anger, not in defiance, but in simple acknowledgement of truth. She turned away before he could respond, her movements fluid and practiced, and walked toward the break room. Behind her, Caldwell's voice regained its edge, though it trembled slightly with something that might have been rage or might have been recognition. "My office. Tomorrow. 0900, we're going to discuss your future at Seattle General." Sarah didn't break stride. The break room was a fluorescent-lit box with a vending machine that hummed in the corner and a coffee maker that hadn't been cleaned in 3 months. The smell hit her first: burnt coffee, something sweet and decaying, the faint antiseptic tang of hospital air that never quite left your skin. She poured the dregs from the morning pot into a styrofoam cup, knowing it would taste like copper and regret. 3 nurses were sitting at the table when she entered, mid-conversation, their lunch containers arranged like a small family gathering. They left within 40 seconds. One remembered she had a phone call. Another suddenly realized she'd forgotten to check on a discharged patient. The third simply gathered her things without a word and drifted toward the ICU. None of them made eye contact. Sarah watched them go with the detached awareness of someone who understood the calculus of survival. Don't associate with the condemned. Don't be on the wrong side when the storm came. She sat alone with the cold coffee, her scrub still stained with the John Doe's blood, type O negative, she'd checked when she'd drawn the lines. The patch was in her locker, wrapped in a plastic baggie underneath her spare uniform. She could feel its weight from across the hospital, a stone in the water, a breach in the careful architecture of her manufactured normalcy. 20 years she'd built this life, the quiet night shifts, the competence that never crossed into leadership, the careful invisibility of someone who'd learned that being seen was a liability. And in one moment, with one patient's borrowed jacket, she'd torn it all down. Or rather, it had torn itself down the moment Caldwell recognized what he could exploit, what he could use to finally cement his authority over her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 02 for 5 hours, when the monitors started screaming. Sarah was in Bay 4, finishing the evening assessment on a post-op abdominal patient, when the alarms erupted from the trauma bay where they'd admitted the John Doe 6 hours earlier. The pulse oximeter shrieked. The blood pressure monitor produced a single, sustained wail, the sound of catastrophic failure. She moved before her conscious mind registered the direction, muscle memory and instinct propelling her through the curtain and into chaos. The patient's chest was caving inward with each attempted breath. His lips had turned the color of old bruises, the distinctive blue-gray of someone whose blood was no longer carrying oxygen. The monitor displayed a rhythm that was all over the place, ventricular fibrillation dancing across the screen like an EKG having a seizure. His sister was in the hallway, screaming her brother's name. Dr. Caldwell arrived 45 seconds later, taking command with the confidence of someone who'd never actually saved a life in a crisis. "Chest tube. Get me 2 units of O negative. Someone call for an OR." His orders were textbook, appropriate, utterly useless. They didn't have 20 minutes. Maybe they had 4. "Missed arterial bleed," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his instructions like a scalpel. "Subclavian. The day shift missed it. I didn't ask for your diagnosis, nurse." Caldwell's voice had that sharp edge again, but underneath it she could hear panic trying to claw through. He didn't know what to do. His authority didn't extend to improvisation, to the split-second decisions that happened in the space between life and death. Sarah assessed the patient's chest with her hands, reading the presentation like Braille, the way his breath sounded on the left side versus the right, the collapse of the lung field, the distension of the veins in his neck that screamed blood backing up into the thoracic cavity. The memories crowded in without her permission: San Jin, a marketplace, a mortar round that had come from nowhere, a Rangers squad leader bleeding out in a mud compound while she held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop. Then Caldwell made his move. "Martinez, you are needed in ICU immediately. Davis, we've got an incoming ambulance, trauma activation, I need you in triage." His voice carried across the bay like a general issuing commands. Strategic. Calculated. Isolating her from the only 2 competent nurses on the shift. Setting her up to fail solo. The patient's oxygen saturation plummeted, 62%. 58%. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a frantic staccato that sounded like a countdown. His sister's screams from the hallway had taken on a different pitch, the sound of someone watching their world end in real time. Sarah made the decision in the space of a single heartbeat. She could follow protocol, could call for the OR that wouldn't be ready in time, could place the blame on the day shift and Caldwell's incompetence and the systemic failures of a hospital that buried mistakes in bureaucratic language. Or she could remember who she'd been before she became someone who stayed invisible. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hesitate. She found the service medal in the evidence bin, the faded campaign ribbon that she recognized because she'd earned the same one in the same war, in the same valley where young soldiers learned the true cost of survival. She held it for exactly 1 second, let the weight of it anchor her to the part of herself she'd buried 20 years ago, and then she set it aside and reached for the scalpel. Caldwell was on the phone demanding the OR, demanding everything he could think to demand. Sarah's hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, in worse conditions, under fire, with a child's life depending on keeping her nerve steady. This was muscle memory in its purest form, the kind of knowledge that lived in your hands even when your mind tried to forget it. The room contracted around her. Everything else became noise. Everything except the patient, the bleeding, the terrible arithmetic of oxygen and time and the decision to break every rule that governed her life in order to keep him breathing. That was when everything changed. The monitor's alarm screamed at 0300 hours like nothing on earth should scream. Not the soft periodic beep of routine monitoring. This was the shriek of catastrophic failure, the sound of a human body betraying itself in real time. Sarah's head snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been restocking supplies, her hands moving before her conscious mind caught up. ICU Bay 4. The John Doe. She was moving before the second alarm joined the first. Dr. Caldwell was already there, his face slack with the particular panic of a man who'd spent his entire career avoiding actual emergencies. He stood frozen at the bedside, staring at the monitor where the blood pressure had collapsed from 110 to 78 to 62 in the span of 4 heartbeats. The patient's oxygen saturation was dropping like a stone thrown from a cliff, 94 to 88 to 82. The color draining from John Doe's face was a map of internal bleeding, a road map Sarah could read in her sleep. His chest, Sarah said, not moving to the monitor, but to the bed itself. She could see it now, the subtle rise and fall gone lopsided, the left side of his ribcage oddly still. Pneumothorax, tension. Missed arterial bleed when we closed the laceration. She was already pulling back the dressing, her hands moving with the economical precision of someone who'd done this exact thing before, in compounds where the electricity failed and the generators ran on diesel and prayer. Caldwell's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water. His phone was in his hand. We need to get him to OR, we need to call. But Sarah wasn't waiting for what he needed. She didn't ask permission. That was the moment everything fractured, the moment she stopped being Nurse Chen and became something else entirely, something that had never really left her despite 18 years of scrubs and hospital lights. She grabbed the scalpel from the crash cart in one smooth motion, the weight of it familiar in her palm like returning to a language she'd never forgotten. The incision went between the 4th and 5th ribs without hesitation. The blade moved the way surgical steel moves through flesh when there's no time for gentleness, no margin for second-guessing. The smell of blood rose immediately, copper and salt and the particular iron scent of a body flooding its own cavity. She'd done this in Sanjin with a combat knife borrowed from a Delta operator and a child whose name she never learned, whose hand she held while helicopters shook the sky like angry gods. What the hell do you think you're? Caldwell's voice cracked like he was still in his 2nd year of residency, still unsure if he deserved the title he'd purchased with his wife's foundation donations. Sarah's hands were already inside the chest cavity, slipping past tissue that parted like curtains, her fingers finding the source. There, the left subclavian, torn clean from where it had bled into the space between lung and rib. The wound was flooding the left hemithorax, collapse happening in real time, and if she didn't clamp it in the next 60 seconds the patient would arrest. Irrigation and suction. Now. The voice that came out wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who'd commanded 18 soldiers through a valley that wanted them dead, who'd made decisions that kept people breathing when everything in the world was trying to kill them. It was Major Chen, and she'd been buried so deep that even Sarah had almost forgotten she existed. The remaining nurse, Rodriguez, competent and terrified and smart enough to recognize authority when it walked through a medical crisis like it owned the place, scrambled to position the suction while grabbing the irrigation syringe. Sarah's left hand held the artery while her right found the vascular clamp on the crash cart, a satin sky clamp with jaws that could hold without crushing. The metal was cold and familiar and absolutely certain. She applied it with movements so economical they could have been choreographed, clamping the vessel while her other hand continued applying pressure, containing the hemorrhage. The monitor's screaming eased. Still elevated, still alarming, but no longer the flatline panic of imminent cardiac arrest. The blood pressure climbed like she was pulling it up with her bare hands, 65, 71, 78, 85. The oxygen saturation stopped its death dive and began its slow recovery. 84, 88. 91, the patient's color shifted from the ashen white of exsanguination to something approximating human again, skin flushing with returning blood and returning oxygen and the particular redness of someone who'd just come back from the edge. Sarah's hands continued working with the kind of precision that comes from having already performed a procedure while shrapnel exploded around you, while children screamed in the distance, while the entire world was trying to kill you and you had to keep working anyway because bodies don't understand war. They just understand blood and air and the electrical signal that keeps the heart beating. She found sutures in the tray without looking, her fingers knowing where they were before her eyes could confirm it. The subclavian was being sutured with stitches so small and so perfect they could have been textbook illustrations, the kind of work that separates people who'd learned medicine in classrooms from people who'd learned it under conditions where failure meant body bags. By the time the OR team arrived, pushing through the ICU doors at 0312 hours with their scrubs still warm from the call room, the crisis was already ancient history. The patient was stable. The bleeding was controlled. Sarah was standing back from the bed with her hands relaxed at her sides, looking at the monitor the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved 3 times over. Caldwell stood exactly where he'd been standing when she made the incision. His phone was still in his hand. His face had moved past purple and into a shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was now the medical emergency. He stared at her like she'd materialized from somewhere outside his understanding of the world, like the rules he'd spent his entire career hiding behind had just evaporated in the space between one breath and another. "Get her out of my OR," he said to the surgical team, his voice small and sharp as a knife. "This patient is now under anesthesia's care. Everything she touched needs to be documented. Everything." He was already turning away, already talking into his phone before he'd even left the room, his voice dropping to the particular tone of someone making calls to people who owed him favors. Sarah stepped back from the bed without emotion, without triumph, without anything in her face that might give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd landed a blow. The composure was absolute, a mask so complete it had become indistinguishable from the woman wearing it. She watched them wheel John Doe toward the operating theater, watched the fluorescent lights track across his face, watched his vitals climb into the safe zone where they belonged. She was still standing in Bay 4 when the message reached her phone at 0618 hours. Subject line: immediate suspension, administrative investigation. By 0600 hours, the suspension notice had been typed, printed, and delivered to Sarah's locker before she finished her shift notes. Dr. Caldwell had moved with surgical precision, 3 phone calls before dawn, each one a calculated cut. The State Medical Board received a formal complaint citing dangerous improvisation, reckless disregard for protocol, performing procedures outside her scope of practice. The language was precise, the accusations framed in clinical terminology that made her life-saving decision sound like criminal negligence. He'd copied the hospital's legal department and the foundation board chair, his wife, ensuring the complaint would move faster than Sarah could think to defend herself. By 0630, her supporting staff had been reassigned. The nurses who'd worked alongside her for 3 years received new shift assignments without explanation. The respiratory therapist who'd stood ready with her hands moved to pediatrics. The trauma surgeon who'd actually scrubbed in after the thoracotomy and quietly documented exactly what had happened, he was suddenly needed in the OR for a 15-hour surgical marathon. Isolation had a smell. It smelled like antiseptic and abandonment, like the fluorescent lights overhead had gotten brighter while the people around you had gotten smaller. The official suspension letter arrived at 0700. Her credentials were revoked effective immediately. Her hospital ID would no longer grant access to any patient care area. She was ordered to vacate her locker within 72 hours. A 30-day investigation would determine whether the state medical board would launch a formal hearing. The hospital, the letter assured her, was protecting patient safety during this period of administrative review. The language was corporate and clean. It had nothing to do with the fact that she'd kept a man breathing at 0300 hours when his chest cavity was filling with blood. Nothing to do with the fact that Dr. Caldwell had frozen. Sarah sat in the Seattle General parking garage at 0830, and she did not turn the key. The engine sat dead beneath her hands, the same way her career sat dead beneath her feet. The Honda was 12 years old, the color of exhaustion, parked in the same spot she'd used for 3 years of night shifts. Above her, the concrete ceiling pressed down like the weight of every hospital that had ever trained her, every protocol she'd followed, every time she'd deferred to a doctor whose only qualification was his last name on a plaque. The Ranger patch was in her pocket. So was her expired military ID, the one that said Major Sarah Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment, valid until 2004. Both were ghosts. Both were proof of a life that officially didn't exist. She'd been erased twice now. The first time had been surgical. After Sanjin, after she'd carried an 8-year-old boy 3 miles through Taliban fire with his blood soaking her fatigues and his screams muffled against her shoulder, the CIA had decided the village raid never happened. 300 civilians, the weapons cache, the school that doubled as a command post, all of it had been retroactively erased from every database, every record, every official report. The raid had been authorized by people who would deny it under oath. So the people who'd conducted it had to be erased too. She'd been given 24 hours to remove her name from the Army database. Her service records had been destroyed. Her commendations had been locked behind classified clearances. She'd walked out of a secure facility with a separation package, a false civilian employment history, and instructions to never speak about what she'd done. This erasure was slower. This one used bureaucratic process instead of executive order. But the result was the same: Major Sarah Chen, erased. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The vinyl was warm from the morning sun. Through the parking garage concrete pillars, she could see other vehicles arriving, day shift nurses, orderlies, physicians who got to exist in the world with their full identities intact. She watched a young woman in scrubs walk toward the entrance, her badge clipped to her pocket like a permission slip to be alive. In her pocket, the Ranger patch felt like it was made of lead. She could feel the thread where it had been sewn into the fabric of a jacket that no longer existed, the same jacket her patient had been wearing when the ambulance brought him in bleeding. The patch was faded, the edges worn soft from decades of being carried, being hidden, being kept like a talisman by someone who understood that the only proof of your past was what you kept in your own hands. She'd saved his life. She'd put her hands inside his chest cavity and found the arterial bleed that everyone else had missed, the bleeding that was happening slow enough to be invisible on the first scan, fast enough to be lethal if it wasn't stopped in the next 60 seconds. Her hands had known what to do. Her hands had remembered how to do emergency surgery in a mud brick compound under mortar fire, except this time it was clean and fluorescent lit and she had all the blood products in the world available if she needed them. She'd kept him alive. She'd done the job she was trained for, the job she'd been doing for 20 years in exile. And now she couldn't remember why she'd kept going. She'd survived sniper fire in Sanjin. She'd survived an IED that killed 3 of her team in 2003. She'd survived the CIA's decision to erase her from existence. She'd survived 20 years of nursing night shifts in hospitals where nobody knew what she'd done, nobody knew what she could do, and nobody needed to know. She'd survived by being invisible. By being just a nurse. By keeping her head down and her hands steady and her past locked away in a patch that she carried like a secret nobody could take from her. But she couldn't remember why. The suspension notice had destroyed that invisibility. It had torn it open in a way that 20 years of hiding never had. Because this time, she hadn't been erased by people in power who needed to bury an operation. She'd been erased by a man she'd humiliated in front of his colleagues. A man whose authority she'd inadvertently challenged just by being competent. A man who had the power to make the state medical board listen because he had a wife on the hospital foundation board and a network of other doctors who understood that protecting your own was more important than protecting patients. Her phone sat on the passenger seat. The termination timeline was still on the screen: 72 hours to clear her locker, 30 days to respond to the investigation, a hearing date set for 6 weeks from now. She'd need a lawyer. She'd need to reconstruct her employment history and training documentation. She'd need to prove that a field thoracotomy was the standard of care in a life-or-death situation where no surgeon was immediately available. She'd need to prove it without mentioning that she'd performed 23 of them in a 6-month deployment. She'd need to prove it without saying that she'd learned surgery not in a formal residency program but in a compound in Helmand Province where the alternative to learning was watching people die while you stood there with medical training you couldn't use. The metal of the steering wheel was cold beneath her forehead despite the morning heat. She could smell the parking garage, oil and concrete and the fading exhaust from a delivery truck that had passed through an hour earlier. Somewhere above her, the hospital's day shift was beginning. People were coming to work. People were going to save lives and be thanked for it and go home with their identities intact. She thought about the 8-year-old boy she'd carried out of Sanjin. She thought about his father's face when she'd laid him down on the extraction point, how the man had grabbed her hand and cried something in Pashto that she didn't understand. She thought about the 16 other people she'd saved that day, the ones who'd made it out alive because she'd kept moving, kept thinking, kept acting when everyone else was frozen by fear. She thought about why she'd done it. And for the first time in 20 years, she couldn't remember. Sarah's civilian jacket hung loose on her shoulders as she walked through the hospital lobby, her deactivated badge clipped to her purse like a relic from someone else's life. The morning light filtered through the glass doors in hard geometric patterns, and her footsteps echoed on the polished concrete, a sound that felt like a countdown. She wasn't supposed to be here. The suspension letter had been explicit: no access to hospital grounds pending investigation. But they hadn't said she couldn't collect her locker. Hadn't said she couldn't walk past the ICU on the way out. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the color of surrender. The patient was awake. Sarah froze in the doorway of the ICU bay. John Doe, the ranger with the patch, the one she'd opened on a stretcher at 0300 without permission, without backup, with nothing but muscle memory and the kind of desperation that comes from watching someone die, was staring directly at her. His eyes were gray and alert and moving with the precision of someone trained to read a room in 3.5 seconds. His right arm was in a sling. A chest tube ran beneath his bandage. But his eyes were awake. And they knew her? He tried to sit up. Failed. A slight wince crossed his face, the kind of minimal response that told her he'd been trained to hide pain the same way she had. "Don't," Sarah said quietly from the doorway. Her voice came out steady. The voice of someone who'd given orders in languages she wasn't supposed to have learned. "Major." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of recognition that made her blood freeze solid in her veins. He reached for the call button, then stopped. His gray eyes held hers. "Sparrow. You're Sparrow." Sarah's hand found the door frame. She didn't remember moving toward it. Her breathing stayed even, training, not choice, but something inside her chest had just cracked open like a door swinging onto a room she'd sealed shut for 20 years. "I was 8 years old," he said, his voice still a whisper but gaining strength. "Sanjin. You carried me. 3 miles through fire. Through Taliban positions. I remember your face. I remember the way you wouldn't let me cry. You said, pain is information, not permission to quit." His eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady, ranger training holding the line. You saved me, Major. And I became a ranger to find you. To say thank you. The ICU around them seemed to compress into a single point of pressure. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in the next bay. Monitors beeped their monotonous counting. But Sarah heard nothing except her own heartbeat and the echo of a child's voice from 2 decades past, a small boy whose weight she'd carried through mountain passes while rounds impacted the rocks around them, while she whispered promises to him that she'd make it, that he'd make it, that someday he'd understand why she couldn't let him stop moving. Your name, she said. Who are you? Marcus Webb. Captain Marcus Webb, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. And I've been looking for you since the day I realized I was alive because of you. The hospital administrator appeared in the hallway before Sarah could respond, not running, but moving with the purposeful velocity of someone who'd been alerted to something classified. Behind him came 2 officers in dress uniforms so crisp they looked like they could cut glass. The insignias on their collars indicated nothing Sarah needed to see. She already knew what this was. She'd been erased once. She recognized the machinery of resurrection when it arrived. Major Chen, the administrator said, and the use of her rank, her actual rank, made her turn. His face was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd just been briefed on something that superseded his authority. These officers need to speak with you. In a secured room. There's a classified file. Sarah followed them to the administrative wing, where the walls were thicker and the doors locked from the inside. The colonel placed a file on the table. His face was weathered like an old boot, creased in ways that spoke of deserts and high altitudes and decisions that hadn't come with clear answers. When he opened his mouth, his voice came out like parade ground gravel. Major Sarah Chen. Your service record. The real one. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. Not from fear. From something else, something that felt like the center of gravity shifting under her feet. The pages were there. All of them. The redacted ones, the supposedly destroyed ones, the documents she'd been told no longer existed. Bronze Star. The citation was right there. Her name. Her operation. Her choice to carry a bleeding 8-year-old boy through hostile territory instead of calling for extraction. Silver Star. Another page. Then another. 2 silver stars. The documents detail her actions in a raid that officially never happened, in a village that officially didn't exist, saving civilians in a conflict that officially wasn't her unit's mission. Each citation was written in the formal language of military bureaucracy, translating blood and fire and impossible choices into official recognition. Purple Heart, the colonel continued, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. Shrapnel. Sanjin Valley. Treated yourself, continued operations, completed mission objective. Navy Cross. Sarah's breath caught. The highest award for valor. Presented posthumously, according to the paperwork, to soldiers who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. But she was sitting right here. Alive. Reading her own non-existent death recorded in official documentation. Your service in operations designated classified, the colonel said, saved 214 lives. Civilian and military combined. Children, women, soldiers, interpreters. 214 people who walked out of Sanjin because of your decisions and your expertise and your refusal to leave anyone behind. Dr. Caldwell stood in the corner of the room. Sarah hadn't noticed him arrive. He was staring at the citations like a man watching his house burn down. His mouth opened once, a word started forming, but the hospital's attorney cut him off with the kind of voice you didn't interrupt. Your investigation, Dr. Caldwell, triggered a comprehensive audit of your tenure at Seattle General. The attorney didn't look at him. All eyes remained on the documents. That audit uncovered 3 years of falsified patient records. Altered charts. Medicare billing fraud. Complication reports that blamed nursing staff while your own diagnostic errors were the actual cause of patient harm. Caldwell's face went the color of old bone. The same meticulous documentation you used to document Nurse Chen's violation of protocol provided the evidence needed to prosecute you for federal healthcare fraud. The hospital board has voted for immediate termination. Your medical license is under review by the state medical board. You're being escorted from the premises. Security is waiting in your office. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the sound of Caldwell's chair scraping backward as he stood, his hands shaking, his mouth working like a fish pulled from water. 2 security officers appeared in the doorway. They'd been waiting, Sarah realized. They'd known how this would end. He walked past her without looking, his expensive shoes clicking on the tile, the sound of a man whose entire world had just become a hole he couldn't climb out of. The colonel placed a document in front of Sarah. "We'd like to offer you a consultant position. Combat medicine training. Your expertise in field procedures is needed. Your service can finally be recognized. Your rank can be restored. Everything that was taken." "Can it?" Sarah asked quietly. Her voice had changed. Not louder, but different. The way a weapon becomes a weapon, not through aggression, but through recognition of what it actually is. "Can you give back 20 years of erasure? Can you restore the operations that officially never happened? Can you bring back the soldiers I couldn't save?" "No," the colonel said. "But we can stop pretending you don't exist." Marcus appeared in the doorway of the secured room, still in his hospital gown, still bandaged, but moving with the careful deliberation of a soldier who decided the 4 in his arm wasn't worth the time it took to disconnect it. His sister stood behind him, tears streaming down her face, her hand over her mouth. "Major Chen," Marcus said, and the use of her rank from the mouth of a boy she'd saved as a child, now a captain, now a soldier, now alive, made something settle in her chest that had been falling for 2 decades. "Thank you for not forgetting me." Sarah signed the papers. For hours later, she walked out of Seattle General in her dress uniform for the first time in 20 years, the faded Ranger patch secured in an evidence bag marked classified, and 3 medals pinned to her chest, the Bronze Star first, then the Silver Stars, then, last, heaviest, most consequential, the Navy Cross. Not posthumous. Active. Real. The weight of official recognition pressing against her ribs like a hand finally allowed to hold her. 6 months later, Major Sarah Chen stood in a training facility at Joint Base Lewis McChord, teaching combat medics the techniques she'd developed in Sanjin. Her scarred hands moved with the precision of someone who'd stitched wounds by moonlight and performed emergency surgery with whatever instruments were available. The young soldiers watched with something approaching reverence as she demonstrated a field thoracotomy using a fresh cadaver and a trauma knife, the same procedure she'd performed on Marcus Webb with nothing but training and desperation. Dr. Caldwell checked IDs at the Seattle General night entrance, wearing a security guard uniform that hung on his frame like a confession. His medical license had been suspended. His house had been seized for restitution. His wife had filed for divorce the day the fraud charges were filed. The nurses who'd once deferred to him now walked past without acknowledgement, their eyes deliberately focused somewhere else, anywhere else, on anything that wasn't the hollow shell of a man who'd tried to destroy someone he'd never bothered to understand. On Sarah's office wall hung the faded Ranger patch, framed and preserved, mounted beside a photograph of Marcus Webb in his dress uniform. Below it sat another image, Marcus at a family barbecue, holding his 3-year-old daughter, both of them smiling with the kind of genuine joy that only comes from people who understand what it means to almost not exist. Marcus called every Sunday. Not out of obligation. Out of something deeper, the bond between a soldier and the person who'd refused to let death have her. They didn't talk about Sanjin often. They talked about his daughter's school, about training cycles, about the quiet everyday victories that meant you were alive to experience them. One evening, Sarah returned to Seattle General to visit Marcus during his final follow-up appointment. She moved through the ER in dress uniform, her medals catching the fluorescent light, and the nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room straightened with uncomfortable recognition. The ones who'd been there that night, the ones who'd left her sitting alone with cold coffee while Dr. Caldwell plotted her destruction, they saluted. Their faces carried the kind of shame that doesn't wash away. At the entrance, Caldwell looked up from his clipboard. Their eyes met across the threshold of the place where he'd almost made her disappear. Sarah paused. She could have walked past. Should have, by every tactical assessment she'd learned in 20 years of combat medicine. Instead, she spoke 5 words that made him flinch like she'd struck him. "Power is not a title," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "Power is the ability to help." Then she continued inside, where Marcus waited with his sister, both of them alive, both of them smiling, both of them finally allowed to remember Sanjin without erasure. Sarah Chen had been buried twice, once by the army, once by a hospital. But the ground had never held her. Some people are too necessary to disappear. Some stories are too important to stay buried. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everyone else together. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, if you've ever had to hide who you really are to survive in a system designed to break you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the hidden heroes walking among us. Comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position? Leave a comment and let's talk about the sacrifices we never see. Thank you for watching.